the strategic initiatives at the School of Social Service Administration, and he's also the faculty director at the University of Chicago Open Network. His research topics include community organization and development, community social organization gathering, and comprehensive community initiatives. It also involves youth development, associations and non-profits associated with philanthropy and social change in a community. He also deals with social housing policies, knowledge utilization and evaluation, and also cross-national research. So today, for the lecture, Professor will be giving us a talk on remaking the inner city with respect to specifically the design principles, regulatory regimes, and integrationist aims and large-scale public housing.
Thank you. If I were to leave this here, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Yes? No? How about now? No? Yeah, here's one. If I hold this, I may be tempted to break into song. You don't want that, trust me. So, okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. All is well? Good. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk today. I apologize for the very long title. You think I got paid by the word? That is not, in fact, the case. But I want to talk today about public housing reform as a response to concentrated urban poverty. I don't know how much you know about the United States or about our public housing policy or about the dynamics of poverty and race in our cities. Anything that you have questions about throughout the talk, please feel free to interrupt. Better, and if you can't hear me or can't understand me, please interrupt, and I will respond to your questions. And then we'll have time at the end for further discussion. Okay, so I'm going to try to do sort of four things today. First, I want to just sort of set the stage a little bit and talk to you about urban poverty and public housing reform in the United States. And then I'm going to outline some of the ideas and the strategies behind integration that lie behind current public housing reform. By public housing is what we call social housing. It's publicly funded and subsidized housing in the United States. Third, I'm going to talk about some of the findings about how these reform efforts are playing out, with a particular focus on mixed income communities that are being built on the footprint of large-scale public housing. This will become clear in a moment. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about conclusions and implications. So what I'm going to talk about is based on a research project that I've just wrapped up over the last 7, I guess it's 8 years, with 6 years in the field. That's briefly the methods we use. So this is an in-depth field investigation in 3 of the public housing redevelopment sites that are circled there. Chicago is built along a lake. On the south side and the west side are primarily African American and very poor neighborhoods, and those are the neighborhoods in which public housing is largely sited. For those of you interested in beach reading, if you want to hear the whole story, that's the book that is coming out in November from the University of Chicago Press. It's a page-turner. It's like a mystery novel. You'll love it. Okay, so concentrated poverty and public housing. Public housing in the United States was initially created under the Franklin Roosevelt administration in the wake of the Great Depression. So it was a moment of tremendous economic upheaval where a very large proportion of the population was dislocated from the workforce. So all of a sudden, many people could not afford to rent or buy housing in the market, and the federal government stepped in. Initially, public housing was focused on transitional housing, right? So this was housing for people presumably temporarily dislocated from the workforce. It mainly housed the working poor and the upwardly mobile poor, not the most poor people living in cities. And mostly it was small scale, low density, and scattered throughout the city. So these are some photos of the early public housing in Chicago built in the 1940s. After World War II, so after, in the late 1940s and 1950s, a number of changes took place in particularly northern industrial cities. There was, starting with in the early part of the century, picking up during the war and then after World War II, there was a massive migration of African American rural workers from the south into the cities of the north. So they came to work in industry, where there were well-paying jobs. This led to a number of other changes in these neighborhoods, however, including, so there were, at the time, there was legally sanctioned racial segregation. So African Americans could only live in certain parts of the neighborhood. As more and more blacks moved into the cities, they were more and more pressured and crowded in these neighborhoods and began to expand. White working class residents began to move out of the cities and into the suburbs. This was facilitated by some rather unsavory practices on the part of real estate agents and banks who refused to lend money in African American neighborhoods, who engaged in campaigns of propaganda to scare white residents that their neighborhoods were going to change, they were going to become violent, they should move out, and then they turned to handsome profit by dividing homes and units and renting them to African Americans. This led to the kind of urban crisis, what was called at the time sort of new urban poverty, right? Where you had high concentrations of poor and often racial minority populations living in certain parts of the city, and slums began to proliferate and become more dilapidated, more prone to crime. And so there was a large push by the federal government under the urban renewal legislation to remake these blighted areas through large-scale slum clearance. Some of this will sound familiar to you in Bombay, right? The slum clearance, along with slum clearance, came the redevelopment of these areas, not so much to house the poor, but to try to revitalize the city. So investment was going into downtown areas to expand institutions like hospitals and universities, to build convention centers and attract investment and business visitors, and to develop middle-class housing. But you had to do something with these poor people, and so they began to expand public housing quite significantly. So from these small-scale, scattered public housing complexes, we began to build large-scale, highly concentrated tower blocks of housing. So initially, this idea of public housing from a design perspective was very much informed by modernist ideas of how to reclaim the city, right? So we needed to, this premise on the idea that we needed to sort of sweep away the chaos of the 19th century industrial city and replace it with a sort of rational, well-designed city. You'll recognize, I assume, these renderings. So, functional separation of parts of the city, residential areas connected by transportation, towers in the sky. These images are what informed much of the public housing development at this time. So, and this was initially a success, right? So you had on my right is a photo of a Chicago tenement area, right? Faulty infrastructure, poor sanitation, and so forth, replaced by, in this case, Bertram Goldberg designed public housing unit. And these were initially very popular. They had long waiting lists for people to move into them. And there were a tremendous improvement, at least from the perspective of the built environment, to the tenements that they replaced. But very rapidly they began to decline. Really within 20 years, 30 years, less than 30 years, those brand new tower blocks started to deteriorate. Elevators stopped working. Sanitation was very poor. There was no heat in the winter. That's a very serious thing in Chicago. You had increasingly concentrated poverty in these communities. So by 1997, only about 15% of residents of public housing in Chicago had an employed member in their house. The average income was less than half of the poverty line for the city. Violence, drug trafficking, substance abuse, gang activity. These became very dangerous and very problematic places, and they also really exemplified concentrated urban poverty. They were the sites of significant social, racial, and economic isolation of the populations. So why did this happen? Right? Number of reasons. First of all, there was discriminatory site selection. So where public housing was built was in poor black neighborhoods. And this was by design and by legislation. There was an amendment that said that you could not build public housing and house public housing residents in a way that would change the racial makeup of the neighborhood in which it was built. So public housing not only exemplified, but actually contributed to concentrated poverty and racial segregation. The high density of these developments was problematic from the 1950s and the 1960s. They were not, some of them were quite well designed, but often poorly designed. They were very poorly constructed. There was a ceiling on how much money you could spend per unit, and that led to a lot of cutting corners. And the maintenance of the buildings relied on the rental income from of the complex, and the population was too poor to contribute sufficient rent to maintain the buildings. So they very, very quickly deteriorated. There's also changing population, whereas earlier public housing, as I said, housed the working poor. More and more public housing became homes to the very poorest of the poor. So what are the policy responses? So this goes on until the late 1980s. By around 1989, Congress commissions a study on how to respond to deteriorating public housing, and we come up with two sort of policy directions. One has to do with deconcentration, largely through the provision of vouchers, but also by building smaller scale scattered site housing in different parts of the city, trying to move very poor people out of concentrated poverty and into less poor, less racially segregated communities. Scattered site housing received significant resistance from residents of the neighborhoods in which it was to be built. Again, in cities like Chicago, largely driven by racial animus. The second policy direction is development. So in the most deteriorated public housing complexes, it was determined these cannot be saved, and the way to address them is to get rid of them, clear them, and redevelop them. And importantly, redevelop them as more economically diverse communities. So the idea of mixed income development now drives public housing reform. And for some, this is exemplifies a kind of notion of what some call positive gentrification, right? So you're trying to attract investment and trying to attract more affluent members of the community into these neighborhoods. But you're also setting aside some housing units for the poor. So roughly about a third of the housing units in the redeveloped public housing mixed income communities are set aside for low income people. So in Chicago, there's something called the Plan of Transformation, which was announced in 1999 by our former mayor, Richard Daley. And this is the largest effort to transform public housing in the United States. It exemplifies an orientation to public housing reform and to trying to address concentrated urban poverty that's been embraced much more broadly, nationally under a federal law, federal legislation called Hope 6, and internationally, particularly in Western and Northern Europe, Australia, and Canada. This focus on poverty deconcentration, on integrating poor people into well-functioning neighborhoods, and on mixed income or social mix, as the Europeans call it, is very much in common. So the climate transformation uses both dispersal and development approaches. You can see it's a largish effort, 15 years and counting, $3 billion in both public and private investment and counting. The numbers of units demolished, built, and households moved may seem small by Bombay standards, but Chicago standards is sizable. In addition to moving poor people into less poor neighborhoods using vouchers, it includes the demolition and reconstruction of at least 10, we're now counting 14 units in developments. And very much this is organized around, sort of embraces the kind of neoliberal urbanism, the idea that government's role here is to facilitate the market and market actors in order to shape urban transformation. So at the core of this, at the center of this climate transformation is an explicit emphasis on integration, right? So the Chicago Housing Authority says the climate transformation aims to build and strengthen communities by integrating public housing residents and its leaseholders into the larger social, economic, and physical fabric of the city. This emphasis on integration is explicitly about economic integration. The plan is silent on racial integration, but virtually 100% of public housing residents in Chicago are black. So this raises a set of important considerations. And there are a set of ideas, sort of theoretical assumptions behind why this should matter. Why integrating poor people into more diverse neighborhoods will be beneficial to the poor, as well as drive larger urban development and benefit the city as a whole. So a set of ideas about how this will change poor people's access to resources and to benefits. So there's a set of arguments about how social capital can be built. Is this something that you are familiar with, this idea of social capital? So the idea here is that basically social resources are embedded in networks of relations, and part of the reason that poor people get stuck in poverty is that they lack access to relationships that can allow them to move ahead, right? So poor people may have closed networks. They may know a lot of people who can provide social support, but most of those people know the same things, right? Have the same access to information, for example, about jobs, about how to navigate the bureaucracy, about where to find good schools and so forth. What poor people lack, the argument goes, are weak ties, right? Relationships with people who are connected to wholly other networks, who have access to other kinds of information that can help them not only get by, but get ahead, right? So the idea is that if you move public housing residents or house them in more diverse neighborhoods, they will be next to and interact with more affluent people who have access to information about jobs and opportunity, and they will tap into those networks and to that information. Yes?
So you even said that the idea of racial discrimination was still happening. Like there were a lot of issues regarding racial discrimination still happening. So these neighborhoods where the people were shifted, they might not even agree in some ways to take in the people who are coming.
Right. So on the dispersal side, right, where residents are being moved out into, I used to have a slide on this and I don't anymore. But they would move out into neighborhoods that were presumably better neighborhoods. The short story is public housing residents moving with vouchers out of public housing did move to better neighborhoods in that they were less poor and generally less crime-ridden, but they were still very poor neighborhoods, and they are almost invariably racially segregated neighborhoods. So essentially, the movement of residents from public housing to other neighborhoods using vouchers has in some sense reconcentrated poverty in these other neighborhoods, and certainly has not addressed racial segregation. In the mixed income communities, which is what we'll mostly be focusing on, well, I'll talk about this in a moment, but because it's different by different communities. A second argument on this front is about political and market influence, right? That if poor people live in and among more affluent people, those more affluent people have more influence on market actors and on policymakers, and so poor people will benefit from that influence, right? And they'll get better amenities, better services, more responsive government. So, the second set of ideas here is about the ways in which living in mixed income communities will have an influence on the aspirations, attitudes, and behaviors of poor people. And this is predicated on a notion of, that sometimes we talk about as a culture of poverty, right? And the idea is that, or this is the underclass thesis, that this new urban poverty, which created neighborhoods of highly concentrated poverty, where virtually everyone was very poor, created a culture of poverty. That poor people in these circumstances began to develop values, attitudes, and behaviors in response to their poverty that perpetuated that poverty. So they were outside of the mainstream, right, in terms of their values and behaviors. This is highly controversial, and certainly if you talk to poor people in these neighborhoods, they would argue that they do not have different values, that we all essentially want the same things, and the issue is about the structure of opportunity, not about a culture of poverty, right? But this idea that poor people in these more mixed income communities would have access to role models, right? They would see people going to work, treating their children in a certain way, taking care of their homes, and they would change their behaviors because of this, is very much still alive in the ideas that lie behind these policies. And then finally, there's a set of design principles that inform these policies. Now, not based on ideas about modernism and what modernism can bring to a rational city, but on the sort of design principles of new urbanism. Do you have new urbanism? Do you talk about new urbanism here? Is this something that you know? So the idea is that so new urbanists are essentially anti-modernists, right? And they're sometimes talked about. They sometimes talk of themselves as they talk about it as traditional neighborhood development, right? Sort of moving down from the superblock development and highly rationalized modernist notions to the small-scale neighborhood that is walkable, that's pedestrian-friendly, that includes, that has a significant focus on transitional and public space, civic space, right, where people can interact. And the idea here is that design, the way you design and plan for a community can actually encourage particular kinds of social interaction. And so this idea of new urbanism is very much has been very much incorporated into the design of these new public housing redevelopments. Although I will argue it happens quite selectively. We'll talk about more of that later. So where are we now? So basically, demolition is complete. 85% of the new housing is developed, but the mixed income developments lag. And there's certainly been some benefits to public housing residents into these neighborhoods. We talked about this in terms of the relocated residents. The physical revitalization of public housing neighborhoods has had a significant impact on the built environment. These are safer neighborhoods, they have better housing conditions. But the broader integrationist goals have not been accomplished. There's continued racial segregation, as we talked about a moment ago in response to a question. There have been no obvious social capital benefits. And there are, as we'll talk about in a moment, new dynamics of exclusion that are playing out in these communities. So I'm going to talk about the mixed income communities. This is really a central manifestation of the transformation in Chicago, even though a very small portion of the public housing residents actually moved into them. That 11% of the public housing residents who were in public housing are now in mixed income communities. So it's a small number, but virtually everybody is affected by these redevelopments, and the vast majority of resources that go into the transformation are being put into mostly the bricks and mortar of developing these new contexts. So again, improved built environment, without a doubt, better economic diversity, at least on the footprint of the developments. In some cases, better racial mix, although in some cases it's middle-class black families who are moving into these neighborhoods. And so you've got economic diversity, but racial homogeneity. And they're much safer neighborhoods, but again, limited economic benefits and new dynamics of exclusion. So why is this the case? I mean, arguably, the mixed income developments are a place where if you have much more control, right, of this social experiment, right? You've got developers and property managers who are responsible for the build-out and management of these spaces, and they're trying to address this in very explicit ways. How? First of all, there's an intentional mix. Right? You have public housing, other low-income rental, market rate rentals, and home ownership units, all in these communities. You've got community building efforts, specific efforts to bring people together, right, through picnics, barbecues, events, movie nights, forums for exchange and engagement, so town hall meetings, block clubs, various ways to try to bring people together. And there are a set of design choices that are meant to reduce the stigma of the public housing residents who are living in these places and encourage interaction. So in some ways, again, this is sort of the best shot at making integration work. So, for example, you see, looking from the outside, you can't tell the difference between units. You don't know. So in either of these buildings, you may have a public housing resident living in this unit, in this house, and a market rate renter living in this house. There's no way to tell from the outside. Similarly with the multi-unit building, there's no way to tell who lives where, at least by the outward appearance of the buildings. And there's an intentional effort to integrate residents either at the block or at the building level. So the red, I don't know if you can see this, the red dots are subsidized renters, so either public housing residents or other poor renters. The blue dots are owners, and the purple dots are market rate renters. So market rate renters are middle class people but who are renting. Now, in this case, the integration takes place really at the block level, not at the building level, except in the rental buildings. So you've got, middle class people and subsidized renters living in the same buildings. So there's this effort to bring them together. But in spite of all of that, you have limited and sometimes contentious relationships between poor and less poor people. And you have unequal participation in the various community building efforts that the developers and property managers are trying to make happen. So public housing residents go to barbecues and bingo nights, and middle-class people stay away. Middle-class people go to their condo association meetings, and renters are not allowed, right? So you have this sort of institutionalized separation. In addition, you have a reliance on a set of, which we'll talk a lot more about, market mechanisms and logics that really drive the nature of these communities and the privileged place of private property. So these are public housing developments that have been handed over to private developers with public subsidies, right, and tax incentives. And in order to make them work, developers need to attract private investment and middle-class homeowners and renters. And related to that, you have fundamentally different orientations to place and space, to what neighborhoods ought to be like, what kinds of behavior are appropriate in public space, what even counts as public space. We'll talk a lot more about that. And these all generate tensions that are sort of fundamental between, on the one hand, social integration and the other, social control, right? Between use value and exchange value, and between order and freedom. So all of this leads to the creation of a set of regulatory regimes and competing visions about community. So I'm going to talk about sort of three of these. One, the sort of dominant orientations, the ideas that drive how this is playing out, and then the sort of mechanisms that through which those ideas work to generate social exclusion for in these contexts, and then some of the responses that they have generated. Yes? Yes? Oh, yes.
What is the percentage of distribution of these different social in
Percentage distribution of social strata in these developments. So it depends. It changes. It's not the same across them. But in general, it's a third subsidized renters. So those are a third poor people. And then kind of a third, the other 2/3 are market rate, either owner or rental.
But how does the developer recover the cost when he distributes this? Because you said that the developer makes this houses and gives it back to the homeowners.
Right. It's a very complicated financial calculus. But basically, there's public funding that supports, direct public funding that goes to the developer to support this. There are then a number of different inputs that attract investment. The most, which we won't really go into, but the most important one I think is the low-income housing tax credit. So essentially, developers can realize a $1 for $1 reduction in their tax liability for developing subsidized housing. So for every dollar they spend on subsidized housing, they can take $1 off of their tax liability. But then there are a number of other funding streams that go into this. It's not quite the same, it's not quite as clean as, at least as I understand, the slum rehabilitation schemes here, where essentially the government provides land, the developers then realize all the profit from that land, the government spends nothing, and the developer can, maximize his profits. But an important point here is that although the sort of policy argument in some ways is that the market, which is presumably more efficient, will help subsidize the subsidized units, right? In fact, it is public policy, largely through tax credits rather than direct expenditures, that is subsidizing the market development. Because there's no subsidy available for the market development. And although developers can't take that housing tax credit or take public money that is directly provided to them and use it to build a market rate unit, they can use it to build a building in which there are market rate units, right? Because there are a lot of common elements to that. HVAC, exterior building, walls and so forth, that are for everyone. So in that way, it does sort of indirectly subsidize.
Does the policy make it essential for developers to build low-income housing?
So with the narrow context of public housing redevelopment that we're talking about here, there are rules about essentially 30% of the units need to be set aside for subsidized rent. Now, those must remain subsidized for 40 years. Now, 40 years is not a very long time in the context of a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, right? So in other words, if the real estate market values go up significantly in these neighborhoods, in 40 years, it's not clear that the developers will have to continue any kind of lower income set aside. In the broader context of development and gentrification, so outside of public housing redevelopment, there are inclusionary zoning laws which require developers to build some proportion of subsidized units or affordable units for every unit for every so many units of market rate units. But that is also, there's a whole bunch of issues around that. The percentage is generally very small. They don't necessarily have to be on the footprint of the development. So you can build affordable housing in a poor neighborhood and not in a gentrifying neighborhood. That's not always the case, but sometimes the case. And what counts as affordable is key to a percentage of the area median income, and that's often not very low. So, working class people maybe, but it would not support the very poor. Okay, so let's talk about these orientations. So, first set of orientations are market norms. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. One is these sort of exchange value orientations. Do we know exchange value versus use value? Okay, so this Marxian notion of use value is value in how you use something, and exchange value is value in how it plays on the market. So as you entice homeowners in particular to try to buy in these places. They want their homes are both meaningful because of use value. They live in there and they get enjoyment from it. But they're also importantly valuable because of exchange value, because they're going to want that value of that home to increase so that they can sell it and turn a profit. The second is middle class preferences about, again, what neighborhoods should look like and how neighbors should perform. And then a set of behavioral expectations that are connected to both of those things to be set, as one developer said, to the highest common denominator. So behavioral expectations are to be set for the highest common denominator. He goes on to say that is business and a fact of life. So what happens in these neighborhoods needs to be pleasing to the homeowners who are buying these goods. And so there are a set of concerns about what we'll talk about more in detail in a moment about incivilities that happen in public space, and those the sort of interpretation of what counts as an incivility are in turn informed by this enduring notion of a culture of poverty and an urban underclass that is outside of the mainstream and that holds different values, and that's why they behave differently. Okay, so a market rate, a homeowner in one of these sites says, I'm a market rate person, you think about your property values. So, you may like the kids on the block and you may think they're cool and you'd like them to hang out, but at the same time, you don't want people driving around seeing these kids hang out because it will give the wrong impression of your property. Okay? And then a homeowner in another site says, and this is where this sort of racial dynamic again comes in, you don't have this going on in communities on the north side. You don't have it going on in white communities, and I just don't think we have to deal with it in our community. The loitering, children just hanging out, they don't live here, why are they 25 just walking down the middle of the street? And you'll note, I think, that our tolerance for particular kinds of norms of public behavior is quite different from our tolerance for norms of public behavior here, although, as I understand it, there's increasing pressure by middle-class urban dwellers to sort of clean up the streets and prohibit this sort of lively street life. Second orientation has to do with broken windows. You're familiar with the sort of broken windows theory of crime? No. So the idea here, this is a majorly influential thesis that suggests that the presence of obvious disorder and of public incivility in neighborhoods, so broken windows, graffiti, trash on the street, people hanging out on corners, drinking, are signs of disorder, and they provide cues to people who are likely to commit crime that this is a neighborhood that has no social control. And so people inclined toward criminal behavior or delinquent behavior see these cues and they feel free, right, to break the law. And that further, if you police these incivilities, right, if you fix the broken windows, if you paint over the graffiti, if you arrest the people selling cigarettes on the corner, you will be able to prevent more serious crime down the road. So that's the idea. There's a lot of argument about this. Empirically, it turns out, I think, not to be very clear that this is the case, that often these incivilities and outward signs of disorder coexists with more and are generated by more fundamental structural issues of poverty and disadvantage. But this remains a very salient issue and has informed policing in many cities in the U.S. Very recently, there's been, I don't know if this has reached the news here, there's been a series of very publicly videotaped and therefore brought to the attention of the public police killings of black people in black neighborhoods in the United States. And some of this is, so one example which took place in New York was Eric Garner was a man, middle-aged black man, selling loose cigarettes on the street. This is not legal, but it's hardly dangerous. Policemen came up to him, there was an argument, and the policeman ended up choking this man to death. Okay? So this is the idea, this is one example, I think, of sort of broken windows policing gone awry. Okay, so that's what drives a lot of this. This is concern about safety and security that is connected with ideas about, with the idea that incivilities and outward disorder generates more predatory crime down the road. And it turns out that certainly concerns about crime are salient. They're salient for everyone in cities, and particularly in American cities where anyone can buy a gun at any time. At your local Walmart, you can buy a gun. But really, most of the concerns, as you talk to people in these neighborhoods, are more about these incivilities. For poor people, for people in public housing, these are much safer environments, and they feel much more free to live comfortably in them, to send their kids out to play unsupervised and so forth. And crime trends, in fact, are generally down. So a public housing resident says, I thank the good Lord, I can finally release him, my son, to have some type of socialization, because he could not play outside at Ida B. Wells, the former public housing complex. There was too much shootings, right, and it bothered him. So here, she lets her kid out. And violent crime is down, as you see, quite significantly in the three public housing developments. Now, those of you who are reading the papers, crime is up again in Chicago, violent crime is up again. It tends to be concentrated in poor black neighborhoods, and it tends to be connected with crime, gang and drug trafficking. But anyway, crime is down. Now, this trend, which is annual, however, sort of obscures a more seasonal variation. So Chicago is is a city of extreme weather. It's can get very hot in the summer. It gets very cold in the winter. So in the winter, people go inside. When the warm weather comes, there are more people on the street, crime goes up, and concerns about crime and incivility go up as well. So it's not that these concerns about incivilities are unconnected to concerns about crime. It's that they are not rationally connected in all cases, if that makes sense. Okay, so crime is a concern, but mostly the concern is about a broad range of incivilities. Noise, unsupervised youth, hanging out on corners. There's a large range of behaviors that homeowners and middle-class residents describe as unacceptable and incivil and make them unhappy. Hanging laundry on the balcony, leaving shoes outside, eating in public. So it's quite a broad array. Right, so we talked about this. So part of this is about specifically the broken windows thesis. That is, if we police these behaviors, we will avoid crime down the road. But really, much of it is in response to the basic preferences of middle class residents in these places. And again, the urban unclass narrative plays out here, and residents make a kind of seamless connection between these two things, between fears of crime and incivility. So one homeowner says, I think the message the property management is sending is we care. We want you to live in decent housing, but we also want you to care. We don't want people living in this housing who are going to mess it up. That's drug dealing, that's prostitution, okay? That's clear, those are clearly criminal acts, right? That's selling cigarettes out of the back of your place, okay? Not legal, but hardly threatening. That's loitering at 2 a.m. Loitering means being out in public. That's people swinging by in the car with loud music, right? The whole kind of attitude. So the idea of criminality gets expanded to incorporate these sort of incivilities. Similarly, a homeowner portfolio says, look, I feel safe around here, but if someone wanted to buy my unit, I would sell, because this is not what I bought into, right? People who hang out in the corner, the youth, watching them run from house to house. And then the public housing resident sort of in response, not directly in response, but in response to this whole attitude, says they're acting like we're the problem in our community, but we've been like this, right? They have a problem with us standing on the corner. We're colored, that's what we do. We gather in groups. We don't have to have no drug activity in order to hang out together in corners. And there's this whole idea about, this whole very different idea about what neighborhoods are as sites of sociability, right? For many of the residents in public housing and who came out of public housing and many of the low-income renters, public space, streets, the areas in front of your building are areas of socialization, of sociability. For middle-class homeowners, they want that to be in private. They want the streets clear and quiet. So how does this? So in response to these incivilities, we end up generating a set of responses, both through privatization and through regulation. And in part, this is these responses get more virulent during periods when crime is perceived to increase. They often entail a sort of routine constraining of activity in public space, and they are pretty much always targeted toward the low income and particularly the public housing population in these communities. So a developer on one side says there's a huge distinction between renters and owners, right? So in this building, actually he's talking about subsidized renters. Owners will do things that are annoying to other condo owners, right? They won't put their trash down the chute. They'll leave their pizza boxes out. Whereas renters, it happens all the time, a tax credit renter, a subsidized renter, that's selling drugs out of the unit. So there's this perception that poor people are doing fundamentally different things, different in fractions than more middle-class people. And this leads to privatization, surveillance, regulation. So regulation comes in a couple of different flavors, right? One is governing private people. So there are a range of lease requirements, house rules. There are work requirements, household maintenance, drug testing. There are rules about guests and visitors that are meant to constrain renters, particularly low-income renters' behavior and how they address the space. And they also, it's about policing public space, controlling and redefining, in some cases, public space. So there's more controlled access to what is acceptable to public space. There are defined use and codified prohibitions to how you can use public space. And much of this is about limiting the use of public space for basic issues. Barbecuing, loitering is a big thing, and it really just means the visual presence of people on the street. Now, these people on the street are invariably African American. In some communities, so are the homeowners, and they are therefore presumed to be poor as well. So space, talked about design as one aspect of controlling space. One way it's controlled is through the use of design. So here's where the sort of selective use of new urbanist ideas comes into play. New urbanism talks a lot about civic space and transitional space. So it's often a very suburban and critiqued as a very suburban sort of orientation to design. They make a lot of porches, right? So this transitional space between the private space of the inside of your home and the public space of the street, where people can sit out and sort of engage with the community, but they're sort of in their home as well. So there's the civic space notion, but then there's also this notion of defensible space, right? That you can design the built environment in ways that promote safety because they promote ownership of public space. So you have individual entrances, presumably the people living in these units are going to take responsibility for policing those doorways, so people won't be gathering, committing crimes, painting graffiti, and so forth. And then you have controlled play spaces. So this is a gated and fenced-in play area that is available and accessible to the residents of these communities, but it's open at certain hours, not open to the public more broadly. And then you've got very little public space. In this site, which is of the three we studied, has the largest area of parkland. The parks are on the periphery. They're closer to the homeowners. So I'm sure you remember from the last slide with the distribution of households, right? Owners are living here and here, and here. renters are living here and along the edges here. So you have public space, but it's not integrated very well into the community. The most integrated space is this, this strip of green here, this boulevard. This actually connects sort of, from a planning perspective, to the broader, the Burnham, you know the Burnham plan in Chicago, 1909, big master plan for Chicago. One of the things that Daniel Burnham did was set aside a lot of parkland all along the lakefront, and then a sort of network of boulevards with parkland that connected neighborhoods throughout the city. So this sort of echoes that. But and people like to barbecue on it and hang out and play ball. But many of the homeowners don't think that that is parkland. That's green space to look at, but not to use, right? So these, even where there is public space, it becomes a point of contention as to how it should be used and by whom and when. Right? So a developer says, look, the public housing residents used to be able to stand outside in the hallway in front of a building, cuss each other out and all that. You can't do it that here. It's a violation of your lease and the projects you could do that. So curtailing public behavior. You can't go, a subsidized renter says, you can't go on the front. They don't want you on the front, right? They don't want you out the back. You can't barbecue. And you never live nowhere where you can't go out the back of your house and barbecue. You're a prisoner in your own house. So these rules disproportionately affecting poor residents and very much disproportionately felt problems. How are these mechanisms maintained? One is through surveillance, property management, police, unit inspections, CCTV cameras, recruitment of residents by property management to provide information. So, apropos of recruitment of residents, right? According to my visual inspection, says a property manager, I can look at a building and say, I need to go visit this person on the second floor, just by looking. I mean, I can see there's too much traffic inside the building, and when I start noticing, hey, this traffic has a pickup in traffic, there's something going on. So is someone dealing drugs in this unit? What's going on? And the thing is, I don't so much as go over there. I call residents inside the building. I have a good relationship. I say, hey, what's going on in your building? And they tell me. Right? So for those of you sort of students of governmentality, this notion that you can manage, right, citizens, you get them to manage their own behavior through informal means and not through direct government intervention. So for some people, for some public housing residents and low-income renters, this is a fair trade, right? They've left. So one public housing resident says, for example, says, look, we came out of the projects where there's roaches, there's rats, the elevators don't work, the heat doesn't work in the winter. We get this nice place in this safer neighborhood. The rules are what you expect, right? But for many, this has really a panopticon quality, right? The idea is that they are constantly under surveillance, walking on eggshells, and constantly in danger of losing their lease, and then potentially losing their housing subsidy, because these are permanent housing choices. So a public housing resident, on one side says, it's like everything you do, they know about it. And on another side, believe me, you're being watched. The cameras. And if anything goes wrong, they pull you in the office. They're going to tell you every detail. One other point I think I want to make when I said earlier about property unit inspections. So the rules for renters are meant to apply equally to all renters, including middle class market rate renters. So every renter is required to allow people in to inspect their units once a year. In practice, market rate renters tend not to have to be inspected, and subsidized renters are often inspected 4, 8, 12 times a year. Partly this is because of who funds those units. They have a stake in making sure those units are being maintained. And so you have residents actually opening the door every month to people inspecting their units. So right, so the surveillance is followed by penalty. And this penalty has differential impact, right? Increasingly, as the complaints of homeowners increased, the efforts on the part of property management to address those complaints has increased. 3 strikes and you're out kinds of provisions. Zero tolerance for criminal activity. This often includes the criminal activity of relatives. You're also often, you can be held accountable for the behavior and the behavior of your guests. So a public housing resident at one site says, if your grown child has committed a crime outside the area, they're telling you that these people can't come and visit you. Right? They're going to immediately evict you from the property because you have a visit from a relative who has committed a crime. I don't agree with that. It divides families, it separates families. Instead of bringing them together, you're actually isolating people. And then the CHA staff member, so this is the Chicago Public Housing Authority, on his way to a meeting at one of these sites, sees a couple of black kids sitting on the steps in front of a house. He says, you know, what are you guys doing here? Do you live here? They say, no, we're just hanging out. He knocks on the door of the unit and tells the renter that, you know, look, you can't have young black guys hanging outside your house. You'll be held responsible if something goes wrong. So, sort of back to the idea of defensible space, this person is not defending her space appropriately and could be held accountable. What are the responses to this? One is, so what we have, so we'll recall 2 hours ago when I started talking that the main sort of thrust here is around the notion of integration, that where poor people have been isolated and segregated in concentrated poverty, we can address these problems by effectively integrating them into well-functioning communities that are economically diverse. Instead, I think what we're finding, for the most part, is what I'll talk about as incorporated exclusion, right, rather than integration. So they are spatially incorporated into these neighborhoods, but they are essentially excluded from networks, from the positive dynamics of the neighborhood, and have not largely connected to the kinds of opportunities that integration was meant to provide. So a public housing resident says, we're like a little testing mouse. They just want to see if we're going to make a wrong move. That's why they give us 3 strikes like we're set down animals, right? So that's one response, right? Exclusion. The second response is a kind of pushback, right? And the reappropriation of space. So where rules and design prohibit or take away space for socialization in public, some residents are going to reappropriate that space. So Market Rate Renter complains, they need a park for the people that are loitering on the street. They're in front of your house. They're congregating in front of the building with 10 chairs. Kids running up and down the street. They're using the parking lot like it's a park instead of a parking lot. You don't have a party every day in a parking lot, right? So this sort of reappropriation of space then in turn ratchets up, right, the complaints of homeowners that leads to more virulent suppression. But probably the largest response is withdrawal, right? So again, rather than effective integration, rather than being able to build relationships and benefit from those relationships through social capital, many residents are simply withdrawing. I'm just going to stay in the shell of my house and mind my own business. When they come for me, they come for me, right? And part of this response is due to the very real and much more serious consequences of sanction for public housing residents in particular, because they've chosen these mixed income developments as their permanent housing choice, and if they lose that, if they're evicted from that, they may lose their subsidy entirely. All right. So wrapping up, certainly there have been some. This sounded very, very dark at the end, but certainly there have been some benefits. But the broader integrationist goals clearly have not been met. The continued segregation for voucher movers, which I didn't talk about. There's been little economic and social integration in those neighborhoods, and certainly in the mixed income communities. And so you move from segregation instead to incorporating. Why is this the case? I'm going to argue that, we'll talk about four things very briefly. One has to do with some basic sort of miscalculations theoretical disjunctions and implementation problems, right? One is the assumption that spatial proximity is going to lead to positive interaction. And I think one of the things that was underestimated was the really vast social distance between the poorest and the most affluent people in this community. Second is an emphasis on role modeling, the idea that by living in and among middle-class people, people who have been living in concentrated poverty for generations would change their values and behaviors. As I said, these renters would argue that they don't have differences in values. We all want our kids to be safe. We all want a happy home. We want to live in safe neighborhoods. And so this emphasis on role modeling underemphasizes the institutional barriers and the structural factors that keep people in poverty. And fundamentally, this is related to a kind of reliance on spatial solutions to what are really very complex economic and social problems, right? Public housing reform is about addressing concentrated urban poverty, but it doesn't really address poverty. It's not even designed, really, to address poverty, right? It's a spatial solution, and what you need to do to address poverty lies far beyond what providing housing can do. And finally, I think an overemphasis or overly optimistic sense of how market processes and the private sector can lead to the accomplishment of the social ends of addressing poverty. Certainly, the market has a role here, and it's possible, I think, to leverage the market and for the state to leverage the market to lead to social ends, but they are not. It's not necessarily a natural occurrence, right? And the over-reliance on the market, I think, has led to an underemphasis on some of these social ends, as we've seen. So, obviously, fundamental tensions that are playing out in these places between integration and exclusion, between use value and exchange value, between order and freedom, between appropriation and control, and these fundamentally characterize in some ways these communities. And I think there are implications which maybe we can talk about that I have now spoken longer than I intended. I think there are implications for design and the allocation of public space, that we need to think about both better integrating public space and incorporating, figuring and allocating them for actual public use in ways that will not require people to pull chairs up in front of their homes. I think there are issues about governance and participation. That the ways in which norms get set for what community behavior should look like ought to be a community process. These norms were largely set by developers and by homeowners and other higher-income people. There were participatory processes that were put in place early on, but the relative voice and influence of the poor was quite small relative to other players. I think that there's a role here for reorienting the idea about what urban life is like. So many of these market rate and more affluent homeowners have come from the suburbs or from, in some ways, suburban-like neighborhoods in the city, but often from the suburbs. And they don't tend to embrace the idea of the city as a place of diversity and public space and public action. I don't know quite how you do that. Part of it, though, I think is a marketing question. That is, I think that the developers underplayed what these new communities were going to be like. They did not talk about the fact that there were public housing residents in them. They didn't necessarily hide the fact, but it wasn't part of the issue. I think if you market these in different ways, you might attract residents who are interested in living in diverse communities and would be more prone to engage differently. And then finally, these sort of limitations of local and of housing, which I talked about a moment ago. Over-reliance on housing as a response to poverty, and under-emphasis on the broader structural factors that produce and reproduce poverty in the groups. So with that, I will no longer talk, and I invite questions, comments, and concerns. Thank you. Questions?
Any questions?
When you yeah, when you speak about spatially, when these colonies, maybe there are some limitations to how they work, or when you talk about the backyard, the front yard, and say the green patch in between, in terms of typology of housing, when housing colonies are designed, how much do they take, how much of a study is done with how previously people were living in their houses? I mean by slums, right now if we see in, slums also do have a typology. I mean if you see like the study that our college has done for Dharavi, or the projects that have been done. So there is a study of the existing, and the new housing which comes up for them would be also with respect to how they previously lived. So when you move people from, say, their current slums to some other housing, sometimes it doesn't work because maybe of the way they work or the way they live. So people otherwise have a problem. So when you design, when these housing colonies are designed, do they actually look at how previously people were living in, or how the way that they use space depends on how they live. So that's why it creates problem of people who use space differently. So when you combine them both, it really becomes a problem of how it is designed then, because then it's not more of a problem with the people, but the way people use space. So when you design these colonies, do you actually have a study of typology of housing done across various communities within the city or these communities?
There were, yes. The short answer is yes. But so let me in the so there were processes. There was a process of planning that included public housing residents. Who I think that so they lived in these tower blocks, the big public housing, were towers surrounded by grass. And they used all that public space around the towers to barbecue, to hang out, to socialize, right? Even in the context of extreme violence, right? There was a certain amount of use of these people. The market rate people who are going to move in and buy or rent at market rate are coming from very different contexts. And they place a premium on privacy. The public housing residents are not opposed, and in fact love their units and love they love the built environment in general. They love the buildings, but they have a different orientation to what reasonable use of public spaces. The homeowners don't view these areas in front of homes, parking lots, street corners, as public space, right? They view them as I guess, as transitional space. You move from your car to your home. You socialize in your home or in your backyard or on your balcony. Sometimes renters don't have these private backyards, so they use public space instead. But also it's a matter of preference. So once one public housing resident says, they want us to hang out in the back, you don't see anybody out back, right? If you hang out in the front, people drive by, you can say hello. It's a fundamentally different orientation to space. And the emphasis or the privilege is placed on the preferences of the middle class. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Also, one more thing. Usually when, say in this city, like because I stay here, so keeping a compound wall to in a lot of housing colonies, or if a colony has a public space, it only becomes of that colony. It only belongs to that particular colony, whereas everybody, just living even next door cannot use actually that garden in between. So that's how it goes on for many societies in the city. When new towers are developed or new buildings come up, they do cater to the idea of the public space or the use of that public space, but then it is only for those particular people. In your master plan, in many of the master plans that we see in the West, they don't really have this idea of the compound wall, which is quite prominent, at least in Mumbai, because everybody wants, even if it's a public space, it is somebody's public space.
Right.
So, how do you tackle that problem? Because when you start fencing the garden that you spoke about, it starts happening. It comes closer to what is happening in the city of Mumbai, actually.
Yeah, I mean, so these developments are thought of as a whole, right? So a playground is for the residents of the development as a whole, right? The parks are public property. They're not part of the development, and they're for everybody in the city. Anybody can use the park. So. So there's a similar, I think it's a similar dynamic, right? You have, but so if you have a condo building or a homeowner building like a colony association, those public spaces are the property of that building, and the residents of that building manage and monitor and determine who gets to use it.
So you showed the crime rate graph and how it's reduced over time in Chicago. So my question is, since people are being told not to stay on the streets, not to socialize, has there been a reduction in, has the social interaction, the main character of living in your city life reduced? I know there won't be a study to look at, but visibly, you see lesser people on the streets now, especially in these areas.
Well, in these developments, can you hear me?
Yes.
In these developments, absolutely. So one of the things that's striking to me is how few people there are on the streets, right? So now I don't live there, so I'm sure that this happens, but in general, these are pretty quiet neighborhoods. Very different from when the public housing tower blocks were, and different than other parts of the city as well. Much more quiet.
You said that in day-to-day life, these neighborhoods are quiet. You just said that. What usually happens during public festivals to these neighborhoods? Again, if I compare to the city of Mumbai, public festivals are sort of a spectacle here. They're celebrated in massive scale. So what usually happens during public huge festivals, say Christmas or say Halloween or say maybe Thanksgiving, or those are some of the huger events that happen across the country. What is the life usually in these neighborhoods like?
Yeah. So these neighborhoods are really quite residential. So we don't have public festivals in all neighborhoods like you have here. In some neighborhoods, particularly ethnic neighborhoods, you would have that. So, for example, and actually so I'm thinking about Little Italy in New York, right? There's this festival of San Giovanni. Anyway, there's a festival of a saint every year, and it becomes a huge tourist draw. There's all these people on the street. That's a very different kind of neighborhood than these. These fields, fairly suburban, fairly quiet. Big public festival, Christmas, Thanksgiving. These are home, private things. There may be things in public. On Christmas there'd be a big, municipally funded Christmas tree. That's downtown in a public square where people don't go to. So there's just not really an analog. Yeah, it's just not really an analog. Other questions?
Throughout your presentation, what I liked is that you were constantly referring to the conversations or the interviews that you had with the people who live there. What I found common in some of them is that every time you ask people about the neighborhood, they always refer to their own house or the street which is facing their house or their backyard, but no one really is talking about public amenities like maybe libraries or schools, because apart from open spaces and boulevards and parks or waterfronts, they are also built spaces that gather people. Like not festive spaces as what he said, but like day-to-day common buildings that actually gather people from all age groups or various all ethnic groups and color. So what are like are there in these in the examples of the communities which you gave, are there any such places for people to gather apart from open spaces, especially built spaces? And also what are the kind of policies governing these spaces in terms of the restrictions, or in terms of the like restrictions in terms of how you like there's a kind of a problem in people sort of gathering otherwise. What are the various policies associated with these built gathering spaces?
So it's a great question. I didn't get a chance to talk about this. This is another example, I think, of how new urbanist principles are selectively embraced. Because new urbanism and by the way, I'm not a massive proponent of new urbanism, but this is what they say they're doing, right? But it does talk about mixed-use space, right? It's, neighborhoods are lively because there's things to do. There's civic space. There's not just houses. There's stores and restaurants and cafes and so on. These communities are large. And this is different, actually, largely different than the public housing redevelopments. These social mixed income redevelopments in Europe, or at least the ones I've seen in Europe. These are largely residential. So there's an idea that commercial space, other kind of civic amenities, grocery stores, community centers, recreation centers, and so forth should be there, schools, but the focus has been on housing. The one, of our three sites, the one exception is the smallest one, and it has, along one strip, set aside space on the ground floor for commercial businesses. So in that case, there's a Starbucks, there's a sandwich shop, there's a few other things. And I think this is a big issue. That one of the other, this is part of the design allocation public space question, that if you can integrate more of these public spaces where people can gather together and not even interact, right, just be together in unproblematic ways, this may have an important impact. Now, there are some other amenities that existed prior to the redevelopment. So in West Haven Park, there's a large youth and recreation center, but that carries with it the sort of stigma of it having been there before, right? So public housing, other low-income renters use that center as they have. Homeowners tend not to. Homeowners will talk in the small one that I just talked about with the Starbucks. There's a little sort of town kind of park center, like town center, very much controlled, but homeowners will talk about, I don't really go there very much. Usually nobody's in the park, and if nobody's in the park, I'll go there. But if people are in the park, I stay away, right? So, so anyway, it was underemphasized, and I think it's slowly beginning to be developed in some of the sites, and I think that may have an impact down the road. As far as regulation goes, I can't remember when, maybe 15 years ago, the then mayor of Chicago and the city council passed an ordinance designed to curtail gang activity in neighborhoods that said any more than 3 people standing on a street corner is a gang, and that's illegal. Right? That was eventually deemed unconstitutional, and so there are no regulations that say you can't stand up, that you can't stand here, right? But there are other ways to curtail standing on the corner. There are regulations about barbecuing, for example, certainly on the sidewalk, but you're allowed to barbecue in parks in designated areas. So the laws don't, the formal laws don't necessarily track homeowners' preferences about the use of open space. Other questions? Everything else is perfectly clear? Yes.
Public housing, at least presently the way it's conceived of as housing that cannot be built profitably in the marketplace. So poor people's housing.
Right.
Earlier, public housing was, at least targeted comprehensively. So even the middle-income people, working people, and poor people could live in public housing. How much of, and you spoke about that, the privatization, kind of a neoliberal framework, which is within which public housing is being conceived of and built now. Do you see part of the solution as lying in the revival of the older idea of public housing as being broadly targeted instead of being targeted towards a certain section or a certain income, people with certain income?
I think it's I think that it's not quite accurate to say that public housing was broadly targeted. It was certainly not targeted to the very poorest, and it was meant to be transitional housing for working people. Right? It actually ended up housing a lot of the early housing ended up housing a lot of military workers during the war years, and it was always. Public housing was always constrained by the very powerful real estate lobbies. So it was always constrained so that it would not compete with the market, right? I think that, but I do think that, and I think what we're moving toward actually is a backing away from public housing entirely. So I do think that, well, I guess what I think is we need to focus on an array of strategies that can produce affordable housing at a range of price points for people to live in. And that housing ought to be not spatially segregated. So I think the idea of a mixed income community, right, where you have a range of incomes, including quite poor people and maybe quite wealthy people, is a perfectly fine idea. I think that part of the challenge here is that the dynamics become so fraught on the footprint of these places because of the way that the state and the market are interacting, because of the reliance on the market. And because of our basic faith in the market, right, that we're more or less comfortable not seeing poor people in our daily lives, right? So I do think we need to have a much stronger emphasis on affordable housing policy. I think they can take a range of forms. I think inclusionary zoning, more robust inclusionary zoning laws would be very helpful. I think actually the nonprofit sector can do a lot of this as well. Most of our affordable housing is produced not by the state, but by community development corporations, which are nonprofits. But they also tend to work in neighborhoods that are poor. And they tend not to be able to respond very well to the pressures of gentrification. There are a few examples where they do a better job. So if you have a long enough time horizon, it's good to look ahead enough. There's some success around sort of land banking. So CDCs will buy up land or be given land by the city to develop as affordable housing before the land becomes so expensive that it can't be developed. I'm not sure that was a very thorough response.
When you speak about mixed income and when you talk about it in planning, where you show the plan of it's horizontal. So if you have the same same idea going vertical in a tower of mixed income groups. How do you think that would work? Except like the towers didn't work because they, in terms of maintenance or in terms of how they were, that's why they didn't work. But if they would work, do you think it would be a better space than having low density, than having high density, low rise housing? Or because in our city, the future is, people think that the future is the tower. So when the design of the tower comes up, and if there is mixed income, they have some flats reserved for the people who are already there, or if it's a small hut colony developed, so there'll be one building for them, and the other towers then go on for sale. So that is also mixed income, according, like if you see it, there are people of various income living. So that space is apparently seen to be is at least viewed to be working the same way as a space like this would work. So, and it's believed that that it's successfully working in the US, so it's being brought here. So, do you think it actually works like that over there? Or I mean, because it's not through your presentation, it doesn't seem like housing is seen to go vertically up. So,
No,
what are your views on that?
Yeah, so so one of the big critiques and one of the reasons we moved to this new urbanist orientation to public housing was the kind of a spatial determinist critique, right? That somehow these towers were the problem. I don't think the towers are the problem. Affluent people live in big high-rises all the time. High-rises are not the problem. And there are some mid-rise buildings, so 12-story buildings in some of these developments that are integrated on each floor. So you've got public housing residents and homeowners, apartment owners, living as neighbors on these various floors, right? I think that on the one hand enhances the opportunity for interaction, and on the other hand enhances the opportunity for friction. I don't think it's the space itself that can solve this problem. I think this is a social problem, and it needs to be solved through planning and interaction, participatory planning, interaction, and a process that can create collective agreement about norms and expectations.
Why do we choose income as the basis of categorization? And there are other things as what work people do or the interest. So why income in particular? Because I don't know how true that is to each and every when we say middle income groups. How can one house or one family be similar to the other one on the basis of income? Basically, why is that the basis?
Yeah. So, this actually speaks to the. So it's all based on income because it's trying to solve a problem, and that problem is concentrated urban poverty and poor people, particularly poor black people, being segregated into particular neighborhoods and not having access to other neighborhoods. So the policy is about how do we integrate those people into better functioning neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods are better functioning because they have higher income people in them, and because they have higher income people in them, they have all kinds of other things. They have amenities, they have better schools, they have safer streets and so forth, right? So I don't think we assume, so until you get to but there are assumptions, right, at least at the extremes, that income comes with certain kinds of cultural characteristics, right? That's the culture of poverty notion. But even at the other extreme, I think, we have ideas about how very rich people, are, I think, and what they value. That is different in some ways than what middle class or working class people. But I think the reason income is the critical dimension here is because of what the policy is trying to solve. Make sense? Okay. All right. Thank you very much.